But first, this week, there was so much focus on the NSA and the Patriot Act, the bulk collecting of our phone records. And this comes as President Obama received a letter about a devastating threat to our national security. One of the people who signed that letter joins me now, former CIA Director, Ambassador James Woolsey. Director Woolsey, so great to have you here on the show.
Good to be with you, Rita.
You know, so much to talk about. I first want to ask you about Boston this week. What appears to be a lone wolf who seemed to be inspired online by ISIS, planning to behead the police, and conservative blogger Pam Geller. How concerned should we be about these lone wolves and people getting inspired online by ISIS thousands of miles away?
Well, we definitely ought to worry about it. It's happening, and it's happening all over the world. You're starting to see ISIS crop up in places such as Southeast Asia and Malaysia, which it had not before, where many of the Muslims are quite moderate. It is really a very troubling situation, and we're not well equipped really to deal with it. It's a serious problem.
How concerned should we also be about homegrown terrorists, people who are here in America but getting inspired online thousands of miles away?
Well, both. I mean, it is. We are not serious. We are in a war. It's just that only the other side is fighting. By not being serious about security, by not being serious about such steps as whether we're going to let our intelligence services collect against lone wolves or not, we are just setting ourselves up, and it's extremely frustrating to people who watch this substantial share of the time. It's silly. It's crazy.
And we're talking to former CIA Director, Ambassador James Woolsey. You know, you talk about the collection of data and phone records. There was so much debate, of course, this week about the NSA, the Patriot Act. What's your experience as head of the CIA, how important it is to get this kind of mass data?
Well, CIA normally doesn't work on it. It's normally NSA, but the point is the National Security Establishment was doing something extremely useful. We have been able since the 1940s to have something called a mail cover. If there's reason to believe that Woolsey is dealing with terrorists, they may be able to look at my mail, but not at the substance. They can look only at the outside of the envelope, the address, the address it went to, the address it comes from, and the postmark. And then if something happens by somebody I've been corresponding with, then they can get a warrant and look at the substance of what was inside the letter. That's been true for 2/3 of a century, and all NSA was doing was the same thing with respect to emails. They were not and have not been reading people's emails, and that false impression has been given very much by the people who were on one side of this debate, and it's just not true. And they were able to get stopped even looking at the address of where the email was going and where it was coming from and what time it was. And that has hurt intelligence collection against these groups a great deal. We are much worse off today as a result of those changes the Senate passed than if they had just sat on their hands.
Well, and while I have you, and we're talking to former CIA Director James Woolsey here on the Rita Cosby Show. Director, you and I think a very prestigious group wrote a very powerful letter to President Barack Obama about a threat, a different threat, something that we haven't talked about too much, but a very serious threat, the electromagnetic pulse. And I know among some of the other signatories, you had Dr. Peter Pry, who was he served on the Congressional EMP Commission. You also had Jen Bawden, who's on the EMP Task Force, some other heavyweights there. What are your thoughts? Why is this such an important issue?
Well, the Earth has been being bombarded by electromagnetic pulses from the sun for millions of years. But what's new is electronics. It didn't really matter. Even tubes and early electronics, it didn't really matter until we started having modern electronics. And then since early 60s, since people first started detecting some of these things. Electronics are about 1 billion times more capable than they were, but they're also about 1 billion times more vulnerable. So a electromagnetic pulse from a solar event, or what's more troubling, something that is caused by the detonation of a nuclear weapon up in orbit, can fry a major share of our electric grid. If the nuclear weapon is in orbit and it's detonated right over the center of the United States, it might well take out our entire grid. And we've got 18 critical infrastructures in the country: food, water, transportation, banking, et cetera. All 17 of the others depend on electricity. So if the electricity goes, nothing else works. And it's not like there's a storm and you have to put up with that for 2 or 3 days. It's dead. And that is a very, very serious problem, which our government is not focusing on and not dealing with.
And it seems like other countries are far ahead of us on this. Why are we sort of behind some of the others?
Well, Russia and China have very seriously taken all of this and hardened their electric grids, and some other countries probably have started. We have not been serious. We have only hardened some of the circuits that involve essentially Omaha and the president's airplane and so forth. But the regular grid as a whole, this electromagnetic pulse commission says you could make a huge dent in what you need to do with a cost about $2 billion for the country as a whole. That's the amount of foreign aid we give to Pakistan every year. So we could do a lot to harden up and toughen up our grid against things like this, but no one is paying attention, and it's not happening.
And why do you think that is? Because as you talk about, it's the amount we're giving to Pakistan every year in foreign aid, and yet even from a practical perspective, for the folks listening, you think about it, banks could be shut down, transportation could come to a halt, food supplies, no heating, air conditioning, gas for generators. I mean, the residual effect is unbelievable.
Right.
What is it, Director Woolsey? Is it an ignorance? Is it a price tag? What is the reason it's sort of not been a priority as it clearly should be?
Nobody's in charge of the electric grid. The FERC, the Federal Energy, is in charge of transmission rates, long-term electricity rates. The so-called NERC, the National Electricity Reliability Corporation, is essentially a group of people from industry, and they have some public responsibilities, but not others. And then each state has a public utility commission that has some responsibilities. There's nobody you can turn to and say, this person is responsible for making sure the electric grid doesn't go down because the Chinese or Russians, or for that matter, North Koreans, detonate a nuclear weapon out in space. And by the way, one of the many reasons not to go along with what President Obama and his people are doing with respect to Iran these days is it will, I think, hasten Iran having a nuclear weapon from 10 years down to maybe a year or 2 or 3. And that, in turn, is extremely dangerous, because that would let the Iranians, who are fanatics, their leaders are anyway, on this issue, be able to hold the United States at risk.
Well, that's a very other important layer to that. Staggering, too, to think about when you think about the repercussions and the effect, as you're talking about, on electromagnetic pulse. Certainly an interesting and very important topic. And I know you've got a lot of folks on the board and organizing with you, including Jen Bawden. And I mentioned Dr. Peter Prey, a whole bunch of other folks, a lot of prestigious folks who know this area well, as clearly you do, Director. Thank you so much for being here on the show. We really appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Rita.